On national television, in front of millions of viewers, David Goggins reached for a pull-up bar and started pulling. His goal was 4,021. He made it to 2,500 before his body shut down. He tried again 2 months later. This time, his palms split open down to the nerve. A doctor injected anesthetic directly into the raw flesh of his hands and told him to stop. He went back to the bar and failed again. Most people would have accepted that the record wasn't meant to be. Goggins scheduled his third attempt before his hands had even healed. This is the story of a man who turned failure into the most powerful weapon he ever carried. This is part 2 of Can't Hurt Me. If you haven't heard part 1, I'd encourage you to go back and start there. But here's what you need to know. David Goggins grew up in an abusive home, escaped with his mother at age 8, and spent his childhood drowning in poverty, racism, and academic failure. By his early 20s, he was nearly 300 pounds, working as a cockroach exterminator on the graveyard shift, divorced, broke, and going nowhere. Then one morning he watched a documentary about Navy SEAL training, and something inside him came back to life. He lost over 100 pounds in 3 months, passed the test that had failed him twice, and shipped off to the hardest military training on the planet. He survived 3 hell weeks in a single calendar year, ran on broken legs wrapped in duct tape through 5 months of bud slash, and graduated as just the 36th African American in Navy SEAL history. That's where part 1 ended, with a graduation ceremony on the grinder in Coronado, and a man who had finally proven he belonged among the very best. But Goggins wasn't satisfied. He'd found something during those hell weeks that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure, a doorway in his mind that opened only through extreme suffering, and he was determined to walk through it again and again to find out what was on the other side. Over the next hour, I'll take you through the second half of his life, ultra marathons that pushed him beyond anything Hell Week demanded, a world record attempt that broke him 3 times before he broke it, a hole in his heart that should have killed him, a mysterious illness that nearly did, and the philosophy that emerged from all of it. The tools that Goggins built from his own suffering and now offers to anyone willing to pick them up. The cookie jar, the 40% rule, the after-action report, and the 2 words that became his answer to every doubt, every limitation, every person who said it couldn't be done. What if? Chapter 6. It's not about a trophy. In June 2005, David Goggins was at the tail end of U.S. Army freefall school in Yuma, Arizona. He'd spent 4 weeks jumping out of C-130 transport jets from altitudes up to 19,000 feet, learning to navigate the sky at terminal velocity. On his final day of training, while cleaning the bathrooms, the one place on base with cell service, his phone exploded with text messages. Operation Red Wings had gone bad. It was a 4-man reconnaissance mission in the remote mountains of Afghanistan. The team was tasked with gathering intelligence on a growing pro-Taliban force in a region called Sautal-Osar. David knew all 4 men. Danny Dietz was in BUDS/TS-131 with him. Michael Murphy, the officer in charge, was in Class T-35 before getting rolled. Matthew Axelson graduated alongside David, and Marcus Luttrell was one of the first people David ever met in the SEAL pipeline. They'd been discovered by villagers and found themselves outnumbered by somewhere between 30 and 200 armed fighters. A quick reaction force was assembled to rescue them, but one of the Chinook helicopters was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. It crashed into the mountain and exploded. Everyone aboard was killed. 19 Special Operations warriors died that day, including 11 Navy SEALs. It was the worst battlefield loss in SEAL history. Only Marcus Luttrell survived, found by Afghan villagers 5 days later, shot multiple times and barely alive. David was devastated. He needed to do something for the families left behind, the wives and children who would still have bills to pay, still need college educations covered, still need someone to show up and say, "We haven't forgotten you." He found the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, a nonprofit that does exactly that. Within 30 days of a fatality, their staff reaches out to surviving families. They pay for preschool, tutoring, college tuition, books, laptops, room and board. As of the writing of this book, they had over 1,200 kids in their program. David wanted to raise money for them. Big money. and he had an idea for how to do it. A few weeks earlier, he'd been searching online for the toughest foot races in the world and stumbled on something called Badwater 135, an ultra-marathon that starts below sea level in Death Valley and finishes at over 8,000 feet on the road to Mount Whitney in the middle of July, when Death Valley isn't just the lowest point on Earth, it's also the hottest. David had never even heard of ultramarathons, but the images on his screen terrified and thrilled him. Tortured runners, brutal terrain, expressions that reminded him of Hell Week. He filed the information away and figured he'd come back to it someday. Then Operation Red Wings happened, and someday became right now. He called the race director, Chris Kostman, at 7 in the morning. Kostman was half asleep and not impressed by some Navy SEAL with no ultra-running resume asking for a spot in the hardest race on the planet. He had standards: 100 miles in a single race, or a 24-hour race covering at least 100 miles. Kostman's voice dripped with sarcasm as he issued his challenge. "There's this 24-hour race in San Diego coming up this weekend. Go run 100 miles and get back to me." This weekend, as in 3 days from now. David hadn't run more than a mile in 6 months. He'd been in Iraq with SEAL Team 5 earlier that year, where his only cardio was 20 minutes on the elliptical once a week. He'd been powerlifting and weighed over 200 pounds. His cardiovascular fitness was, by his own admission, a joke, but Kostman had made him. If David walked away from this challenge, he was just another pretender. So 3 days later, he towed the line at the San Diego One Day, a 24-hour race on a 1-mile loop around Hospitality Point, with the most pathetic race preparation in the history of endurance sports. The night before, he went to Walmart and bought a folding lawn chair and his fuel for the entire day: 1 box of Ritz crackers and 2 4-packs of Myoplex protein shakes. That was it. No electrolyte strategy, no hydration plan, no salt pills, no training. Oh, and the night before the race, his old Bujas instructor SBG talked him into a full powerlifting session. Heavy squats and deadlifts at 315 pounds, because according to SBG, that's what the Vikings would have done before raiding a village. David shook his head and racked the weights anyway. The horns sounded at 10 in the morning, and David took off hot, zoomed straight to the front of the pack. Exactly the right move if your goal is to blow up and die. For the first 25 miles, he felt okay. He was keeping pace with a Japanese runner named Miss Inagaki, one of the best athletes in the field. His wife Kate was his entire support crew, posted up in the lawn chair, handing him Myoplex every mile. But at the marathon mark, 26 miles, David crossed into unknown territory. He'd only run a marathon once before, years ago, when he was in peak shape. Now he was untrained, underfueled, and he still had 3 more marathons to go. By mile 50, his quads were loaded with lead, his feet were chafed and bleeding, toenails were peeling off, his shins felt like they were being electrocuted with every step. Ms. Inagaki bounded ahead and disappeared. By mile 69, that gentle 7-foot incline at the edge of the course, the kind of ramp that would make any trail runner laugh, buckled David's knees and sent him staggering backward. He nearly collapsed. At mile 70, he couldn't take another step. He teetered toward Kate and fell into the lawn chair. His feet were caked in blood. His blood pressure was dangerously low. He was dizzy, dehydrated, and starved of sodium and potassium. And then his body did what bodies do when they're pushed past every reasonable limit. He looked down and saw bloody urine leaking down his leg. His stomach gave way. He was sitting in his own waste, in a lawn chair, at a public race, trying to hide it from his wife because he knew if she saw how bad it was, she'd beg him to stop. He sat there for 20 minutes. Runners shuffled past. His dream of Badwater was bleeding out in real time. Kate brought him Motrin, cookies, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and Gatorade. She helped him stand. The world wobbled. He took 1 step. Agony. Another step. Another. She let go. He walked on, way too slow. At a 20-minute per mile pace, he was burning through all the time he'd banked. 4 hours later, at 2 in the morning, at mile 81, Kate delivered the news. "I don't believe you're going to make the time at this pace." David stared at her. mucus and protein shake dripping from his chin, every ounce of life drained from his eyes. For 4 hours, each step had demanded maximum focus and effort, and it wasn't enough. That's when David realized something. This fight wasn't really about Operation Red Wings or the families of the fallen. Those things mattered, but they weren't going to carry him 19 more miles before 10 in the morning. If he was going to finish this race, it would have to get personal. He stared down at his legs, the trail of dried blood and urine on his inner thigh, and he thought to himself, who in this entire world would still be standing right now? Only you. You haven't trained. You don't know anything about hydration or nutrition. All you know is you refuse to quit. And right there, at the lowest point of the hardest night of his life, David Goggins invented the cookie jar. When David was a kid, no matter how bad things got, his mother always kept their cookie jar stocked. Wafers, Oreos, Milanos. Whenever she brought home a fresh batch, she'd dump them all into one jar. David would drop his fist in, pull out a cookie, and before eating it, he'd turn it around in his hand and say his own little prayer of thanks. Standing on that course at 2 in the morning, David used that memory as a metaphor. He stuffed a new kind of cookie jar, not with treats, but with every victory he'd ever earned, every moment he'd overcome the impossible, the time he studied 3 times harder than anyone else just to graduate high school. That was a cookie. Passing the ASVAB, another cookie. Losing over 100 pounds in 3 months, conquering his fear of water, graduating BUDADADS at the top of his class, being named Enlisted Honor Man at Army Ranger School. All cookies loaded with chocolate chunks, and these weren't just memories. David didn't just think about them. He tapped into the emotional state he felt during those victories. He felt the pride, the relief, the defiance all over again. And when he did, his adrenaline surged. The pain started to fade. His pace picked up. He began swinging his arms and lengthening his stride. His fractured feet were still a bloody mess, blisters everywhere, toenails peeling off. But he kept going. Each mile became a victory lap celebrating a different cookie. Mile 81 became 82. An hour and a half later, he was in the 90s. 95. 98. 100. He'd done it. Or had he? He couldn't remember, so he ran one more lap just to make sure. After running 101 miles, his race was finally over. Kate wrapped him in a camouflage poncho liner as steam poured off his body. He was shivering in the fog. He blacked out on the way to their apartment and came to on the kitchen floor. His wife got the shower running and he lay in the tub, naked, in the fetal position, as brown bile came out instead of urine. Kate called David's mother, frantic. A doctor friend suggested he might be in kidney failure. Kate begged him to go to the emergency room, but David refused. Not because he was being reckless, because this was his trophy ceremony. He'd just accomplished the most incredible feat of his life. Harder than Hell Week, more significant than becoming a SEAL. He had run 101 miles with zero preparation, and the pain he was feeling right now was the proof. As he lay there curled up in that tub, shivering, relishing the agony, he realized something that would shape everything that came after. If he could run 101 miles with no training, imagine what he could do with a little preparation. Chapter 7. The most powerful weapon. 27 hours after crawling out of that bathtub, David was back at his desk on a Monday morning. His commanding officer, SBG, had given him every excuse to take days off. Instead, swollen, sore, and miserable, he pulled himself out of bed and went to work. Then he called Chris Kostman. David imagined surprise in Kostman's voice, maybe even some overdue respect. Instead, his call went to voicemail. He left a message. 2 days later, he sent an email explaining he'd run 101 miles in under 19 hours. Kostman's reply threw him sideways. Congrats on your 100-mile finish, but did you actually stop then? The point of a 24-hour event is to run for 24 hours. David couldn't believe it. He'd taken the man's challenge and crushed it on 3 days' notice, and Kostman still wasn't impressed. But that was exactly the point. Kostman had seen dozens of supposedly great athletes crumble under the weight of ultra racing. A single untrained 100-miler didn't prove David could survive 135 miles through Death Valley in July. If David wanted Badwater, he would have to earn it. Again, the only qualifying race available before the Badwater application deadline was called the Hurt 100. Set in a triple canopy rainforest on the island of Oahu, it demanded 5 laps of a 20-mile circuit with 24,500 feet of total elevation gain, sharp climbs and brutal descents through slick jungle trails, one of the toughest 100-mile trail races in the world. And David had never run on a trail before. Not once. He had about a month to prepare. His feet and shins were still destroyed from San Diego, but he strapped on his shoes, taped up his ankles, and started building 100-mile weeks. He ran his 16-mile commute to work in Coronado 3 times a week. On Fridays, he added a 50-pound rucksack and ran 20 miles. Some days he ran home too. On race day in Hawaii, David showed up in standard road running shoes with almost no tread, a camelback water system, and a handful of flavored energy gels. A woman at the hotel saw his meager supplies and poured 100 salt pills into his palm. Take 2 of these every hour. They'll keep you from cramping. David didn't even know what a salt pill was. His camelback broke at mile 6. Then it started raining. The red earth trail became mud within minutes. His street shoes were coated in it, slick as skis. He slipped, stumbled, and fell repeatedly. He sloshed through shin-deep puddles. The jungle smelled of leaf rot. Feral pigs squealed in the darkness. Pit bulls chained up by bow hunters snapped and growled from the trees. By the end of his 3rd lap, around mile 60, David was at the very edge of his capability. He slumped into a chair at the start-finish area, dazed. He had 2 full laps to go, and he wasn't sure he could take a single step more. And this is where David began to understand something that would become one of the most powerful ideas in the entire book. Think about the last time you wanted to quit something, a workout, a project, a conversation, a relationship. In that moment, you felt like you'd given everything you had, like there was nothing left in the tank. Like continuing was not just painful, but genuinely impossible. David Goggins says you were wrong, and not by a small margin. He calls it the 40% rule. And the principle is this: when your mind is telling you that you're done, that you've hit your absolute limit, that you cannot take one more step or do one more rep, you have only tapped about 40% of your true capability. You still have 60% left in the tank. Think about what that means. It means the wall you hit at mile 60, or at rep number 10, or on page 50 of that report you can't finish, is not a physical barrier. It's a psychological one. Your brain is sending you pain and fatigue and doubt, not because your body is failing, but because your internal governor is trying to protect you from discomfort. We all have a governor. It's buried deep in our minds, intertwined with our identity. It knows our history, it knows our fears, and it uses pain, exhaustion, and self-doubt to encourage us to stop before we risk too much. But here's the critical thing. Unlike the governor in a car engine, ours cannot physically stop us. It can only stop us if we agree to quit. David didn't start his 4th lap at Hurt 100 with any sort of conviction. He was in wait-and-see mode. Halfway up the first climb, he became so dizzy he had to sit under a tree. 2 runners passed him. He waved them on, but he told himself something simple: just walk to the top of this hill. If you still want to quit after that, you can. He got to the top. The higher ground gave him a new perspective. He saw another stretch ahead and decided to cover that too, just that little bit more, before quitting for good. And once he got there, he was staring down a long descent. That looked easier than going uphill, so he kept moving. Without realizing it, he'd gotten to a point where he could think again. He could strategize. He was collecting 5% chips, unlocking more energy, then burning it up and collecting more. And hope is addictive. He chunked the rest of the race that way. A little further, a little more. He ran some, walked some, fell on his backside dozens of times on that slippery trail. And at one point during that long, dark night, deep in the jungle, he saw something that would stay with him forever. Karl Meltzer, the greatest trail runner in the field, came charging down the slope behind him. Meltzer was about to lap David, on pace to become the first person ever to finish the Hurt 100 in under 24 hours. And the way he moved was like nothing David had ever seen. He was levitating. His feet barely touched the ground. He bounced on his toes and ran along the edges of the trail, firing his legs into the air the instant they made contact. His head stayed perfectly still. His core was rock solid. He was navigating the most technical terrain at a pace that defied logic, and he made it look effortless. David watched him and realized there was a whole other level of athlete in this world, a level he hadn't known existed. And some of that potential was inside him too, inside all of us. David finished the Hurt 100 in 33 hours and 23 minutes, just shy of the 36-hour cutoff. 9th place out of only 23 finishers. He was so destroyed afterward that 2 people carried him to the car, and his wife wheeled him to his hotel room in a wheelchair. But he was in. Kostman emailed within days. David had been accepted into Badwater. For the next 6 months, David did something he'd never done before. He prepared, not just physically but strategically. He drove the entire Badwater course, mapping every mile, noting temperature and elevation changes, marking the best spots for his crew to set up cooling stations. He Googled videos and read blogs from runners who'd finished it. He studied the terrain like he was studying for the ASVAB, and because the heat terrified him more than anything, he trained in it obsessively. At the SEAL Team 5 gym, he climbed onto the elliptical wearing 4 or 5 layers of sweats, a hoodie, a fleece hat, and a Gore-Tex shell. Within 2 minutes, his heart rate was at 170. He stayed on for 2 hours at a time. When he was done, he wrung out his clothes, and they filled trash bags that weighed 15 pounds. His SEAL teammates thought he'd lost his mind. His commanding officer, SBG, loved it. On July 22, 2006, David towed the line at Badwater. 90 runners, 135 miles from Death Valley to Mount Whitney. He ran the first 42 miles through God's blast furnace, developed a massive blood blister on his left foot, hiked 18 miles uphill to Town Pass as the sun set, ran a bone-crushing 9-mile descent, and marched through the night beneath a sky full of stars. At mile 110, horseflies started dive-bombing him in swarms. Biblical. His crew took turns swatting them off his skin with towels for 8 straight miles. At mile 122, his wife Kate pulled alongside him. Scott Jurek is 2 miles behind you. Scott Jurek, the defending champion, a legend of ultra running. And David was ahead of him. Jurek caught David on the final climb up Whitney Portal Road. He had a pacer with him named Dusty Olson, who ran alongside barking encouragement. David stepped aside and cheered them on. Jurek went on to win by 17 minutes over the second-place finisher. But David didn't care about the podium. He finished in 5th place, 30 hours, 18 minutes, and 54 seconds. He'd wanted to quit 30 times. He had to mentally inch his way through every mile. But he finished. Afterward, at the top of Whitney Portal Road, David lay back on a bed of pine needles and stared through the trees. He could see all the way back to Death Valley. The perfect metaphor for his twisted life. He could see where he'd come from, and as the breeze dried the sweat from his skin and soothed his aching bones, a thought whispered in his ear, "There is no finish line, Goggins. There is no finish line." Chapter 8. Talent Not Required. 3 months after Badwater, David was in Kona, Hawaii, standing on the same beach where the Ironman World Championships are held. But he wasn't there for the Ironman. He was there for something harder, the Ultraman World Championships, a 3-day stage race around the entire perimeter of the Big Island, a 6.2-mile open water swim, 261 miles of cycling, and a double marathon run. 30 athletes, 3 days, 1 island, and David didn't own a bicycle. He'd borrowed one from a friend 3 weeks earlier. It was a high-end custom Griffin built for someone even bigger than him. He borrowed the guy's clip-in shoes too, which were nearly clown-sized. He stuffed them with thick socks and compression tape. He also couldn't fix a flat tire, change a chain, or repair a spoke. He didn't learn bike mechanics before the race. He just logged over 1,000 miles in 3 weeks, waking up at 4 in the morning for 100-mile rides before work. The swim wrecked him. His wetsuit was too tight and shredded his armpits raw with every stroke. Choppy seas made him vomit repeatedly. He swam a meandering line that stretched his 6.2-mile swim to 7.5. He came out of the water with jelly legs, crawled behind the bathrooms, and threw up again. But David knew one thing: stay in the fight long enough to find a foothold. He ate slowly, changed his clothes, got on the bike. 10 miles later, he found momentum and started picking off riders one by one. By the end of day 1, he was in first place. On day 2, 171 miles of cycling through the mountains, David was closing in on the overall lead when his front tire blew at over 40 miles per hour. He somersaulted over the handlebars, cracked his helmet in two, shattered his sunglasses, and destroyed his wheel. He lost 20 precious minutes waiting for mechanics, then switched to a heavy backup bike before they eventually repaired his Griffin. He finished day 2 in third place, 22 minutes off the lead. On day 3, the double marathon, David went out hard, too hard. He wanted to build an insurmountable lead early and coast to the finish. But at mile 35, he blew up. His legs gave out, he walked more than he ran. And a steady, patient competitor called the Land Shark, who had run his own race from day 1 without panicking at David's early surge, caught him and overtook him in the final miles. David crossed the finish line first on the run, but lost the overall title by 10 minutes. The Land Shark was crowned Ultraman, and David learned a lesson that would stay with him forever. The Land Shark didn't win because he was more talented. He won because he was smarter. He didn't react to David's early burst. He welcomed it as the reckless strategy it was, focused on his own pace, and waited him out. David had raced hard, but he'd raced dumb. He had no backstops, no alternative strategies, no plan for when things went wrong. He went all motor, no intellect, and it cost him. What happened next changed the trajectory of David's career in ways he never expected. Thanks to the media attention from Badwater and Ultraman, the Navy took notice. An admiral named Ed Winters called David into his office. When an enlisted guy gets called in by a 2-star admiral, your backside tightens up. David sat stiff as an arrow, avoiding eye contact, sweating through his uniform, expecting to be reprimanded for something. Instead, the admiral asked for his help. The military had a problem. Only 1% of all special forces were African American, even though black people made up 13% of the general population. The Pentagon had flagged the issue and sent it to the admiral's desk to fix. With Al-Qaeda making inroads into Africa and plans to build counter-terrorism forces across the continent, they needed black operators and didn't have them, and they had no idea how to recruit them. David became their answer. For the next 2 years, he was on the road 250 days a year, speaking at high schools and universities across the country. He spoke at inner-city schools in tough neighborhoods. He spoke at historically black colleges where the military wasn't exactly a popular career choice. And he spoke to kids of every background in between. He didn't parrot the Navy's script. He told his own story. The abuse, the obesity, the failure, the transformation. And everywhere he stopped, he also ran an ultra race. In one stretch in 2007, he ran an ultra almost every weekend. 50-mile races, 100-kilometer races, 100-mile races. He'd land in a city midweek, make his speeches, then race on the weekend. 500,000 students heard him speak, and the message was always bigger than the military. David told every kid who would listen that even if they never put on a uniform, they could become more than they ever dreamed. All it took was an open mind, hard work, and the willingness to run toward the things that scared them most. Teenagers are walking, talking nonsense detectors, but they bought David's message because he was living it right in front of them. One kid drove 2 hours to watch him finish the Leadville 100 in the mountains of Colorado. Another group of students trained with him at 4 in the morning, hiking 14,000-foot peaks in the dark before school. 2 brothers from Atlanta who dreamed of being SEALs but kept it secret because it wasn't considered cool in their neighborhood, flew to San Diego to train with him for a summer. Those 2 years on the road were some of the most fulfilling of David's career. But beneath the surface, his body was hiding something that nobody knew about. Not David, not his doctors, not the Navy. In early 2009, David's heart started malfunctioning, almost overnight. For years, his resting pulse had been in the 30s. Suddenly, it was in the 70s and 80s. Any activity spiked it until he verged on collapse. A simple 5-minute bike ride sent his heart racing to 150 beats per minute. The doctors ran an echocardiogram, and 45 minutes into the procedure, the chatty technician stopped talking. More clicking, more zooming. He left the room and came back with another tech. Then a cardiologist walked in, took over the wand and nodded once. "Okay, let's talk. You have an atrial septal defect," the doctor said. "You have a hole in your heart, a pretty good-sized one." David was born with it. The hole was in the wall between the right and left chambers, which meant oxygenated blood had been mixing with non-oxygenated blood his entire life. Every cell in his body had been starved of roughly half the oxygen it needed. Think about what that means. Every Hell Week, every ultramarathon, every race in Death Valley, and every frozen midnight ruck through Appalachian Mountains, he did all of it on half a tank of oxygen. The doctor said the defect also explained his chronic pneumonia issues, the fluid that never fully cleared from his lungs, the nights spent spitting phlegm into empty Gatorade bottles. And it meant something even more terrifying. During deep underwater dives, the kind seals do routinely, gas bubbles could leak through that hole and become embolisms in the brain or heart. He'd been diving with a time bomb inside his chest. "I'm truly amazed you could do all you've done with this condition," the doctor said. David nodded. The doctor thought he was a medical marvel, some kind of genetic outlier. But to David, this was the ultimate proof. His accomplishments had nothing to do with God-given talent or great genetics. He had a hole in his heart. Everything he'd achieved was evidence of what's possible when someone dedicates themselves fully to harnessing the power of the human mind. 3 days later, David was in surgery. The first procedure didn't hold. His heart went into atrial fibrillation almost immediately. His pulse bounced from 120 to 250 and back with no rhythm at all. 14 months later, he went under the knife again. Just before the anesthesia pulled him under for the second time, lying on that gurney, staring at fluorescent lights, a question floated through his mind. If the doctors couldn't fix him this time, was he willing to retire satisfied? The answer erupted from somewhere deep inside him. A single word, loud and clear: no. Chapter 9. Uncommon amongst uncommon. Before the ultramarathons, before the heart surgeries, before any of that, David Goggins was a freshly minted Navy SEAL in his first platoon, stationed in Southeast Asia, carrying the heaviest weapon in his unit through the Malaysian jungle in the dead of night. The weapon was an M60 machine gun, nicknamed the Pig because it sounded like a barnyard hog when it fired. 20 pounds for the gun alone, plus 6 or 7 belts of ammunition at 7 pounds each, plus a 50-pound rucksack. David was the biggest man in the unit, and he carried all of it everywhere they went, expected to move just as fast as everyone else. His first platoon was special. The officer in charge and his second in command, a man named Dana DeCoster, were two of the best athletes in the entire unit. Every morning, the platoon competed in run-swim runs, and those two officers always led from the front. It created a culture where everyone was pushing to beat everyone else, and the whole unit got better because of it. David thrived in that environment. This was exactly what he dreamed of when he signed up. Hard men living the SEAL ethos every single day. He trained relentlessly. While other guys went out at night, David stayed in, reading about tactics, weaponry, and military history. He was a perpetual student, preparing for opportunities that didn't even exist yet. And here's the thing, it paid off. When the Navy opened early screening for DevGru, the elite unit within the SEALs responsible for the most dangerous missions, David was one of only 3 men approved from his screening class of 18. He also earned a slot at Army Ranger School between deployments, something he'd requested 7 times before finally getting approved. Army Ranger School, 308 candidates, 69 days, 3 phases of training across Georgia and Florida in the dead of winter. And on day 1, David was appointed First Sergeant of Bravo Company because the original First Sergeant couldn't recite the Ranger Creed after a beat down on the pull-up bar. The Ranger instructor didn't think the Navy guy would know it either. David cleared his throat and delivered all 6 stanzas from memory, loud enough to rattle windows. He'd been studying it for months, recognizing that I volunteered as a ranger. Fully knowing the hazards of my chosen profession, the instructor shook his head in disbelief and gave David the job, which meant that on top of surviving every evolution himself, he was now responsible for making sure 100 men had their gear squared away, their skills sharp, and their minds in the fight. The training was medieval. They were given almost no food, 1 or 2 field rations per day, a couple of hours of sleep per night if they were lucky. They navigated mountain terrain in below-freezing temperatures without sleeping bags or warm clothes. During one field exercise in North Georgia, a winter storm blew in with 30-mile-per-hour winds, ice, and snow. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Men were coughing, shivering, their eyes wide with terror. When you're that cold and exhausted, the human instinct is to huddle up and focus on survival. And that's exactly what most of Bravo Platoon did. They abandoned their security perimeter and grouped together for warmth. The instructors understood. They were in weather emergency mode, but David saw it differently. He looked at that storm as a platform. If this were a real-world scenario, a storm like that would be perfect cover for an enemy attack. So while everyone else was trying not to die, David dialed deeper. He welcomed the carnage of ice and snow, and he held the western perimeter like it was his duty, because it was. He screamed into the wind from the depths of his soul, and one by one, a few guys heard him. They popped out of the tree line and stood tall, shivering, wrapped in their measly poncho liners. None of them wanted to be there, but they rose up and did their duty. They held a complete perimeter in one of the most brutal storms in Ranger School history until the instructors radioed them to come in. Florida phase was the final test. 10 days navigating the Panhandle with 50 men as a single unit. They jumped from aircraft into frigid swamplands, waded and swam across rivers in water temperatures in the high 30s, set up rope bridges and shimmied across them with frozen hands. David crossed rivers 6 times if that's what it took to help one of his guys tie off a rope bridge correctly. He walked them step by step through tasks they were struggling with. He wasn't just performing, he was leading. For the first time, he wasn't only focused on being the hardest man on the field, he was focused on bringing everyone with him. Only 96 men graduated out of 308. David was awarded Enlisted Honor Man with a 100% peer evaluation. His classmates, his fellow soldiers had valued his leadership in the worst conditions imaginable, and he'd lost 56 pounds doing it. He looked like death, sunken cheeks, no muscle mass left. Men who could do 40 pull-ups couldn't do a single one. At the graduation meal, David found the milk machine in the chow hall, pulled the lever, and watched cottage cheese consistency milk pour out. He drank it anyway. After 69 days of starvation, spoiled milk tasted like sweet tea. After Ranger School, David set his sights even higher. Delta Force, the Army's equivalent of DAVG-RU, the most elusive special operations unit in the military. You never heard about Delta, that's by design. The screening process was rigorous. IQ test, complete military resume, war experience, evaluations. David pulled it all together in days, and his orders came through in weeks. He landed in the mountains of West Virginia ready to compete for a spot among the Army's very best. Delta selection was unlike anything David had experienced. No yelling, no screaming, no one telling you what to do. Orders were chalked on a board in the barracks. Every man was a self-starter. On the first real day of work, they ran an 18-mile road ruck. David took off like a rocket and finished about 30 minutes before anybody else. He broke what the rumor mill considered the course record. For the next 10 days, they hammered physical training and learned advanced land navigation, how to read terrain instead of roads, how to follow ridge lines and water sources, how to make a topographic map come alive in your hands. And then came the extended final exam. 7 days and nights alone in the field, navigating from waypoint to waypoint, with unknown distances and unknown time limits. David crushed it. He was at or near the top of his class on every test, until the second to last day when overconfidence caught him. He hit his first 4 waypoints fast as usual, but on his way to the 5th, He tracked a power line across the valley floor and let his mind wander. He started daydreaming about graduating Delta, about being part of the force, about the missions he'd run. By the time he woke from fantasy land, he was way off course, almost out of bounds. He panicked, found his location, and sprinted to get back on track. Then he discovered there were 6 waypoints that day, not 5. He was out of time. He had 2 options: follow the rules and miss the deadline, or break the rules, use the roads, and give himself a chance. He chose the roads, sprinted, ducked into the woods whenever he heard a truck, made the final checkpoint with 1 minute to spare. But Delta didn't reward shortcuts. They loaded the candidates into covered trucks, and when David felt the speed bumps that meant they were heading back to base instead of the next camp, he knew it was over. A fellow candidate was shocked to see him. "Goggins, what are you doing here? You're one of the best guys out here." David shook his head. "I didn't do what they told me to do. I got this far by staying focused and delivering my best, and I'm going home because I lost focus." It was a devastating lesson, and David took full ownership. He didn't blame bad luck. He didn't blame the extra waypoint. He blamed himself for daydreaming when he should have been executing, for thinking about graduation when he hadn't graduated yet. But the Delta cadres saw something in him. An officer pulled David aside before he left the compound. "Goggins, you are a stud. We want you to heal up, come back, and try again. We believe you will be a great addition to Delta Force someday." David returned 5 years later, after his heart surgeries and 2 more years on the recruitment circuit. He smoked the 18-mile ruck again, breaking his own unofficial record by 9 minutes. He demolished the navigation tests. He was on track to finish in the top of his class. And then on the second-to-last day, his ankle popped between 2 boulders on a steep ravine. He laced his boot tight, kept fighting, but missed his time on a checkpoint. Same result, sent home. But this time, David had no regrets. He'd given everything. Sometimes the body breaks regardless of the mind. What matters is whether you controlled every variable you could. Now here's the deeper lesson that runs through all of this. David's time as a SEAL taught him something uncomfortable about what it means to be truly uncommon. In his 2nd platoon, David was put in charge of physical training. He designed workouts that reflected the SEAL legend he believed in. 5-mile swims on Monday, 20-mile runs on Tuesday, logs over the berm at dawn. The real stuff, the hard stuff. After 2 weeks, attendance dropped. His officers pulled him aside. "This is stupid. We aren't in BUDAS anymore, Goggins." They wanted to do their own workouts, hit the gym, get big. They didn't want to be punished every morning. And instead of adapting, instead of finding a way to meet them where they were and bring them along, David got angry. He ramped up his own training, worked out with the one teammate who was willing to go with him, a man called Sledge, and wore his disappointment like a shroud. He was given the platoon nickname David "Leave Me Alone Goggins." Years later, David recognized that this was his greatest leadership failure. In Ranger School, he'd been extraordinary. He helped every man, he crossed rivers 6 times, he held the perimeter alone. But in his own platoon, with men he'd serve alongside in Iraq, he let his ego take over. He saw what he considered a weakness in his teammates, and instead of helping them grow, he made them feel inferior. The lesson David shares is this: when you push yourself to a level beyond the people around you, it's tempting to look down on them, to feel superior. But that superiority is a figment of your ego. We are all fighting the same battle between comfort and performance. Every single day we choose between settling for mediocrity and being willing to suffer to become our best. A true leader stays exhausted, abhors arrogance, and never looks down on the weakest link. A true leader fights for his people and leads by example. Not to prove he's better than them, but to show them what's possible for all of them. David admits he learned that lesson too late, and it cost him opportunities he'll never get back. But he did learn something else during those years that he carries with him to this day. Something he calls starting at zero. No matter what you've accomplished, no matter how high you've climbed, your refrigerator is never full. You can always become stronger, smarter, more capable, more reliable, which means you should never feel your work is done. Wake up every single day as if you're back on day one. Because life doesn't care about your resume, it only cares about what you do next. Chapter 10. The Empowerment of Failure. September 27, 2012. The second floor of 30 Rockefeller Center. David Goggins stood beneath a matte black pull-up bar wrapped in white tape, stenciled with 3 words, "Show no weakness." Savannah Guthrie was there. A Guinness World Records official was there, and millions of viewers were about to tune in. David's goal was to break the world record for pull-ups in a 24-hour period. The number was 4,020, held by a British athlete named Stephen Hyland. David had done the math. 6 pull-ups on the minute, every minute, for 24 hours would shatter it. 10 seconds of effort, 50 seconds of rest. For an entire day and night. He'd prepared for 5 months. 40,000 pull-ups in training, 400 a day during the week, 1,500 on Saturdays. He was ready, but from the very first rep, something felt wrong. The bar had too much give. It flexed and swayed with each pull-up, dissipating his force and requiring a stronger grip to compensate. By 1,500 pull-ups, his forearms were bulging with lactic acid. By 2,000, he was in serious trouble. He took a 10-minute break. His massage therapist worked on his forearms while he tried to reset for the second half. But the break did more harm than good. His body started shutting down instead of recovering. It took him 5 hours to do 500 more pull-ups, an average of under 2 per minute. The man who normally rocked 1,500 in 3 hours with no trouble was grinding to a halt. After 2,500 pull-ups, David pulled the plug. He couldn't lift his hands high enough to grip the bar. He'd failed on national television, in front of millions of people. So did he hang his head in shame, spiral into self-pity? Not for 1 second. The next morning, David left his phone in the hotel room and went for a run in Central Park. He needed 0 distractions and time to do something the military had taught him years ago. Something he considers one of the most powerful tools in this entire book, an after-action report. An AAR. In the military, after every mission or field exercise, you conduct a live autopsy. You examine what happened, what went right, what went wrong, and what you do differently. And you do it no matter the outcome, win or lose. It's especially critical after a loss. David ran through every variable. First, he listed everything that went well. Because in every failure, a lot of good things happen, and you have to acknowledge them. His commitment was there, his training volume was there, his mental toughness held as long as his body allowed. Then he reviewed his mindset. Was there doubt? Yes. Going in, he hadn't fully respected the record. He thought he could break it on any bar, anywhere. That overconfidence led him to accept a bar he should have rejected and an environment that worked against him. The Today Show studio was a glass box that attracted heat and light. Looky-loos were buzzing in and out, asking for selfies between sets. It was exactly the wrong environment for a man who gets his strength from dark, quiet, painful places. His nutrition was wrong, his break was too long. And he'd ignored the doubters online who predicted his hands wouldn't hold up, dismissing their criticism instead of extracting the useful intelligence buried inside it. 2 months later, David was back on the bar. This time in a CrossFit gym in Nashville, owned by a former Marine named Nandor Tamaska. The bar was bolted into the ground, no sway, no give. The room was dark, sweaty, and real. Everything the Today Show was not. David started slow. 5 pull-ups on the minute instead of 6. He minimized all unnecessary movement. Instead of reaching for his water bottle, he set it on a stack of boxes at chin height and sipped through a straw. Every wasted calorie was a calorie he'd need later. For 10 hours, he was on pace. Rocky's theme played on loop. He found a rhythm and went full cyborg. Staring at the chalk-dusted floor between sets, his mind narrowed to tunnel vision. Then his palms started splitting. The very thing the doubters had predicted. The same bar that gave him power and stability was now destroying his hands. He tried 2 pairs of gloves. 3. Duct tape. Nothing worked. After 3,000 pull-ups, more than 12 hours in, he went into a back room. His crew peeled off his gloves and the skin came with them. Both palms were filleted open to the dermis. the layer where nerves live. A doctor friend arrived, loaded a syringe with anesthetic, and sank the needle into the raw flesh of David's right hand. The pain was extraordinary. She examined his forearms, saw the bulging spasms, and diagnosed him with rhabdomyolysis, a dangerous condition where overworked muscles break down and leak proteins into the bloodstream. If the kidneys can't filter them, they shut down. People can die from rhabdo, David. You shouldn't continue. David could hear Going the Distance booming from the speakers. He knew this was his 14th round, his cut me Mick moment. He held up his left palm. Do the other one. The doctor sank the needle in again, wrapped both hands in gauze and tape, fitted fresh gloves. David walked back onto the gym floor and went back to work. He ground out pull-ups in sets of 2s and 3s, then 1s, using his fingertips, then his wrists draped over the bar. After 3,200 pull-ups, he worked out the math. 800 more at 1 per minute would take over 13 hours. He had the time, but 45 minutes later, the pain was too much. His palms were destroyed beyond anything he'd ever seen. He stopped at 3,200 and left through the back door with his mother like they were escaping a crime scene. In the emergency room waiting area, David sat there holding what was left of his glove. It looked like it had been soaked in blood. His mother eyed him and shook her head. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I know one thing." David turned to face her. "What's that?" "You're gonna do this again." She read his mind. He was already running his AAR, already looking for the treasure buried in the wreckage. And the fact that she knew, without him saying a word, fired him up. David says that most of us surround ourselves with people who speak to our desire for comfort, people who treat the pain of our wounds and try to prevent further injury rather than help us callous over and try again. What we need are people who will tell us what we need to hear, not what we want to hear. People who never say, "Well, maybe it isn't meant to be." His mother never said that. Not once in his entire life. "Tell them I'll be back on that bar in 2 months, David said. Roger that. The third attempt came on January 19th, 2013. Same gym, same bolted bar, same rocky soundtrack. But this time, everything else was different. David had done his forensics. He started slower, 5 pull-ups on the minute instead of 6 to conserve grip strength. He limited breaks to 4 minutes maximum, because both previous failures escalated after long rest periods. He had custom foam pads designed by a mattress company to insulate his palms from the bar. And he cut the number of volunteers in half. Minimal buzz, maximum focus. He also did something powerful with his mindset. Before the attempt, doubters were everywhere online. His arms were too long. He weighed too much. His form was wrong. 2 failures proved the record wasn't his to break. And part of David wondered if they were right. Then he thought about Roger Bannister. In the 1950s, experts told Bannister the 4-minute mile was physically impossible. He failed again and again, and then on May 6, 1954, he ran a mile in 3 minutes and 59 seconds. 6 weeks later, someone else broke his record. And since then, over 1,000 runners have done what experts once said couldn't be done. David decided the pull-up record was already his. He didn't know when it would officially become his. It might be in 2 months or 20 years, but once he decoupled the goal from the calendar and treated it as an inevitability rather than an impossibility, the pressure evaporated. By the 2-hour mark, 600 pull-ups in, the foam had formed perfectly around his hands. He asked Nandor to play Going the Distance on a loop. Something clicked. He went full cyborg again. The blisters came back. The lactic acid returned. After 12 hours and 3,000 pull-ups, the wall hit just like before. His hands were splitting again. His body was back in rhabdo. Every eyeball in the room was on him, and he could feel the weight of 2 previous failures pressing down. He took a 4-minute break, not a second longer, stuffed his ruined hands into padded gloves over the foam pads, walked back to the bar. And this is where David did something that separates him from almost everyone else on the planet. He went ugly, he got dark. He imagined his pain was the creation of a mad scientist named Stephen Hyland, the man who held his record and his soul. It was Hyland who was torturing him from across the globe. and it was David's job to steamroll toward him and take his soul back. To be clear, David had no personal grudge against Hyland. He didn't even know the man. He went there to find the edge he needed to keep going. He got personal in his own head, not out of anger, but to drown out doubt. Because life is a head game, and sometimes you need an opponent, even an imaginary one, to stay in the fight. He ground out sets of 3s, then 2s, then 1s. Hour after hour past midnight, every pull-up demanded total concentration. His grip was failing. His body was beyond rhabdomyolysis. He was waiting for the moment when his arms simply stopped working. After 17 hours of pain, around 3 in the morning, David completed pull-up number 4,021. The record was his. Everyone in the gym cheered. David stayed composed. He did a few more sets, finished at 4,030, pulled off his headphones, stared into the camera, and said, "I tracked you down, Stephen Hyland." In a single day, he'd lifted the equivalent of 846,000 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of the space shuttle. But when he went into the back room, he was not in the mood to celebrate. And that might surprise you. But David's refrigerator is never full. He lives a mission-driven life, always chasing the next challenge. When you live that way and attain a goal, success can feel anticlimactic because the game isn't over. It's never over. The record barely made a ripple in the news. David didn't care. He raised some money, learned everything he could from that bar, and logged 67,000 pull-ups in 9 months. It was time to put them in his cookie jar and move on. Chapter 11. What if? In January 2014, David Goggins won the Frozen Otter, a 100-kilometer glacial trail race set in the frozen wilderness outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The temperature at the starting line was 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The trails were buried in snow. Drifts piled to his shins in some places, much higher in others. His cheap crampons snapped off within the first hour. None of it mattered. Because for the first time since his heart surgeries, David's body was putting itself back together. He was getting 100% of his oxygen supply like everyone else. His endurance and strength were next level, and something else had changed too. Something that had taken years to develop. His running technique. Remember Karl Meltzer, the man who levitated past David at the Hurt 100 all those years ago? David never forgot how he moved, the way his feet barely touched the ground, the way his head stayed perfectly still while his legs fired beneath him. David had been studying those mechanics ever since, practicing them on thousands of training runs, and at Frozen Otter, it all came together. On icy, treacherous trails where one wrong step could end his race, David ran with the precision of a mountain goat. He touched the ground just enough to explode. His head stayed flat. His movement was silent. He disappeared into a meditative state, elevated, floating over terrain that had most runners slipping and crawling. He smashed the course record and won the title without losing a single toe. After 2 years of substandard running, David thought his best days were back. He took that energy into his preparations for Badwater 2014. He was living in Chicago, running 130 miles a week. He felt strong and dialed in. Then during his taper, the 4-week period where you reduce training to let your body recover before a race, everything collapsed. He wasn't hungry. He couldn't sleep. His heart rate was erratic. He gained 10 pounds of water weight in a single week despite eating less. Easy runs sent his pulse into arrhythmia. Doctors couldn't find anything wrong. His thyroid was slightly off, but nothing that explained how an elite athlete had gone from 130-mile weeks to being unable to run a single mile without verging on collapse. David started Badwater anyway. He made it through the opening 22-mile climb in 6th or 7th place, but on the descent his body refused. His breath wouldn't come. His thighs twitched uncontrollably, spasming so hard it looked like something was trying to break out of his legs from the inside. He walked for 4 miles, stopped at a motel where the medical team was set up. They checked his vitals. Blood pressure a little low, nothing else, no explanation. He ate some food, rested, and tried again. 6 or 7 miles later, he looked at his pacer and said, "That's it, man. I'm done." 50 miles. That's all he could manage. And the humiliation of quitting, for a man who had built his entire identity on never quitting, was suffocating, but it was drowned out by something stronger. An instinct that whatever was happening inside his body was serious, that if he didn't stop, he might not make it out of those mountains alive. They drove to Las Vegas. David tried to rest for 2 days, then went for a 1-mile jog. His heart jumped into his throat within minutes. He shut it down. That night at a restaurant called the Elephant Bar, his vision blurred. His mother was sitting across from him, and he saw 3 of her. "You're going to have to call an ambulance," he said, "because I'm going down." His mother drove him to the emergency room. They tested his thyroid, his heart, his blood, nothing. The doctors in Vegas told him all he needed was rest. He went home to Chicago. His own doctor ordered a battery of tests: endocrine system, Lyme disease, hepatitis, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune panels. Everything came back clean except for that slightly off thyroid. They put him on thyroid medication, then diagnosed him with Addison's disease and prescribed steroids. The pills made him worse. Each day he felt more drained. He couldn't get out of bed. He called in sick to work for the first time in his life. And lying there, staring at the ceiling of his Chicago apartment, David Goggins faced the possibility that he was dying. His mind reeled backward through the years. He found all the best parts of his life and tacked them together into a highlight reel. The abused child who escaped, the obese exterminator who became a SEAL, the man who ran on broken legs, who swam with a bomb in his heart, who set a world record with his hands shredded to the bone. He wasn't supposed to be any of these people. He had to fight himself at every single turn. And for the first time in his life, he stopped fighting, not because he gave up, but because something shifted. Lying there, his body tight with pain, David felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel before: gratitude. He wasn't meant to be this person. He knew that. He'd had to claw and bleed and suffer for every inch of his life. He missed out on so much. He didn't have a lot of fun. Happiness wasn't his thing. His brain had him on constant blast, terrified of being a nobody, judging himself and everyone around him. But lying in that bed, possibly at the end, David released all of it. The judgment, the bitterness, the rage. He let go of every person who'd ever hurt him, every hater, every doubter, every racist, every abuser, and instead of resenting them, he appreciated them because they helped create him. And he thought about himself as a child, the kid who cheated in school, who stuttered, who lied about his past. For decades, David had judged that kid harshly, but now, for the first time, he understood him. That boy didn't cheat to hurt anyone. He did it for acceptance. He broke the rules because he didn't have the tools to compete and was ashamed for being dumb. He needed friends. He was terrified of being labeled special. And instead of coming down on that child for one more second, David forgave him. His eyes welled with tears. Not from fear, from clarity. For hours, David floated in that quiet space, surrounded by light, feeling as much gratitude as pain. At some point, the feeling broke like a fever. He smiled, rubbed the back of his head, and felt a familiar knot at the base of his skull. It was bigger than ever. He checked the knots above his hip flexors. Those had grown too, and a memory surfaced. Years earlier, the Navy had brought in a stretching and physical training specialist named Joe Hippensteel. Joe had examined David's body and shaken his head. After 3 hell weeks, years of ultra racing, and a lifetime of fight-or-flight stress, David's muscles were locked so tight, it was like trying to stretch steel cables. "You're gonna need hundreds of hours of stretching," Joe had said. David had ignored him. He was obsessed with strength and power. Flexibility was for yoga people. Now, lying on what he thought was his deathbed, David reconsidered. Could the answer be that simple? Could all of his suffering trace back to muscles so locked up they were choking his organs and compressing his spine? He had nothing left to lose. David pulled himself up and sat on the floor. He tried to cross his legs. His hips were so tight his knees were up around his ears. He lost his balance and rolled onto his back. He tried again, stayed in position for 10 seconds, maybe 15, before the pain drove him out. He did it again and again. He held each stretch until the pain hit 7 out of 10, then rested and went back in. That first day, he stretched for 2 hours. The second day, 6 hours. Before long, he was stretching 12 hours a day, starting at his neck, moving through his hips, psoas, glutes, quads, hamstrings, and calves. The psoas, that was the key. It's the only muscle connecting the spine to the lower legs. It wraps around the pelvis and governs the hips. It's called the fight or flight muscle. And David's entire life had been fight or flight. His psoas was so locked up it had tilted his pelvis, compressed his spine, and shaved 2 inches off his height. It was strangling his blood flow from the inside. Joe Hippensteel confirmed it when David reconnected with him. "Your muscles were like a frozen steak," Joe said. "You can't inject blood into a frozen steak. That's why you were shutting down." After months of continual stretching, the bump at the base of David's skull started to shrink. The knots around his hip flexors softened. His energy returned. He went off all his medication except for thyroid, and slowly, carefully, he started running again with 0 side effects. David retired from the military as a chief in the Navy in November 2015, the only man ever to serve in Air Force Tactical Air Control, survive 3 Navy SEAL Hell Weeks in 1 year, and graduate both Bud/and Army Ranger School. After more than 20 years of service, he became a wildland firefighter. And in 2018, on the 4 Ford 16 fire in Colorado, a record-breaking 55,000-acre inferno in the San Juan Range of the Rocky Mountains, he was out there digging fire lines at 10,000 feet on a 45-degree slope, 18-hour shifts at $12 an hour, sleeping in the open wherever the shift ended, not changing his clothes for 6 days. At 43 years old, surrounded by crew members 15 years younger, David Goggins was still getting after it. But this story doesn't end on a fire line. It ends with a phone call. David was at his mother's house in Nashville after his first fire season when her phone rang at midnight. It was Toughness Jr., David's brother. They hadn't spoken in over 15 years. Toughness Jr.'s 18-year-old daughter, Kayla, had been hanging out with friends in Indianapolis when shots were fired. A stray bullet found one of the teenagers. When his ex-wife called him, he drove to the crime scene, but was held outside the police tape. He could see Kayla's car and a body under a tarp, but nobody would tell him if his daughter was alive or dead. He was asked to identify her from a photograph on a detective's cell phone. David and his mother drove through the night in slanting rain for 5 hours. They pulled into his brother's driveway just after he returned from the scene. He opened the door, took a few steps toward them, and broke down. David's mother reached him first. Then David pulled his brother in. And all of their history, all the years of distance and silence and pain, none of it mattered anymore. David says that life is suffering, and he's not saying that to be dark. He's saying it because it's true. To exist in this world, you have to contend with humiliation, broken dreams, sadness, and loss. Each life comes with its own personalized portion of pain. It's coming for you. You can't stop it. And in response, most of us seek comfort. We carve out safe spaces. We consume media that confirms what we already believe. We take up hobbies aligned with our talents. We spend as little time as possible doing things we hate. And all of that makes us soft. We live inside limits we built for ourselves, not because the limits are real, but because they're comfortable. And the people who love us want us to stay in that box too. Not because they don't care, but because they don't want to see us get hurt. But when you bust out of that box, when you push beyond what you thought was possible, your light reflects off all the walls they've built around themselves, and it forces them to see the contours of their own prison. Some of them will resent you for it, but if they're truly the great people you believe them to be, their imagination will eventually hop that fence too, and it will be their turn to change. And when doubt shows up, when fear whispers that you can't do it, when the people around you say it's impossible, David Goggins has 2 words for all of it. What if? What if is the most powerful question you can ask. It silences negativity. It makes the impossible feel possible. It's the permission to face your darkest memories and use them as rocket fuel. It's the answer to every hater, every doubter, every voice in your own head that says you aren't enough. What if you stopped making excuses? What if you told yourself the truth? What if you gave everything you had and then found more? What if? Now let's close with the challenges from the second half of this book, because Goggins isn't done with you yet. Challenge number 6, the cookie jar. Crack open your journal and write down every victory you've ever had, not just the big ones, the small ones too. Quitting smoking, overcoming a stutter, finishing something you started, losing the first 5 pounds. These are your cookies. And the next time life has you on the ropes, at mile 81 of your own personal ultramarathon, I want you to reach into that jar and pull one out. Don't just remember it, feel it. Let the pride and the defiance of that moment wash over you and carry you forward. Your cookie jar is your emergency fuel supply. Stock it well. Challenge number 7, the 40% rule. The next time you hit a wall, whether it's on a run, in the gym, at your desk, or in a difficult conversation, push 5 to 10% further. Not 50, not 100, just 5 to 10. If the most push-ups you've ever done is 100, do 110. If you normally run 30 miles a week, run 33 next week. This gradual ramp-up prevents injury and allows your mind to slowly adapt, but it also resets your baseline. Because next week, you're going to push 5 to 10% further again, and the week after that, and before long, what you once thought was impossible will be something you do on a Tuesday. Challenge number 8, schedule your life. For 1 week, document how you actually spend your time, every hour, with timestamps. Be honest, you'll find 4 to 5 wasted hours in a typical day. Social media, television, conversations that go nowhere. Then in week 2, build an optimal schedule. Lock everything into 15 to 30-minute blocks. When you work, work on one thing. When you rest, actually rest. No email, no scrolling. There are 168 hours in a week. A 40-hour work week is only 24% of that. You have more time than you think. You're just spending it on things that don't matter. Challenge number 9, become uncommon amongst uncommon. If you've already reached a level of success, if you're already surrounded by high performers, this challenge is for you. What are you doing differently to stand out? It's easy to be a big fish in a small pond. It's much harder when you're a wolf surrounded by wolves. Torch the complacency you feel gathering around you. Put obstacles in front of yourself on purpose, because that friction is where growth lives. Greatness is not something you achieve once and keep forever. It evaporates like a flash of oil in a hot pan. You have to earn it again every single day. Challenge number 10. The after-action report. Think about your most recent failure and your most painful one. Write them out in detail. Start with everything that went well. Then examine your mindset throughout the preparation and execution. Were you overconfident? Underprepared? Did you let doubt take the wheel? Then make a list of what you can fix. Be brutal and schedule another attempt as soon as possible. Consult your accountability mirror. Refill your cookie jar. Apply the 40% rule, and go again, because failure is not the end of the story. It's the most important chapter, the one where you find the clues that lead to the breakthrough. The treasure is always buried in the wreckage. Your job is to dig it out. And the final challenge, the one that ties all the others together. What if? The next time self-doubt blooms in your mind, the next time someone tells you it can't be done, the next time your own body begs you to stop, I want you to pause, take a breath, and ask yourself those 2 words. What if I'm capable of more than I think? What if the only thing between me and the life I want is the willingness to suffer for it? What if? David Goggins grew up beaten, broken, uneducated, and poor. He was written off by teachers, failed by the system, and told he would never amount to anything. He weighed nearly 300 pounds and was working the graveyard shift as an exterminator. And then he decided to go to war with himself. He ran 100 miles with no training. He competed in the hottest ultra-marathon on the planet. He survived a hole in his heart that should have killed him. He broke a world record with his hands shredded to the bone. He served his country on the battlefield and inspired 500,000 students to believe in what's possible. And when a mysterious illness brought him to the edge of death, Instead of bitterness, he found gratitude. Instead of despair, he found peace. And instead of quitting, he spent 12 hours a day stretching his broken body back together and came back stronger than ever. None of it was about talent. None of it was about genetics. He had a hole in his heart. He couldn't read until he was 8. He couldn't swim until he was 12. He failed more times than most people ever try, but he never stopped. And that's the point. That's the entire message of this book, wrapped in a single truth. You have more in you than you know, so much more. The only question is whether you're willing to go find it. If you want to hear Goggins tell this story in his own words, with even more detail and more challenges, I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of Can't Hurt Me. The link is in the description, and your purchase supports both the author and this channel. If this video helped you, hit that subscribe button, leave a comment, and tell me which moment from Goggins' story hit you the hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Now take a moment, reflect on what you heard today. The power to change your story is in your hands. Choose wisely.